Sodom was not a legend. It was a city with walls, grain silos, market streets, and a gate where men sat in legal judgment over their neighbours. The valley it occupied was one of the most fertile agricultural zones in the ancient Near East, so lush and well-watered that when Abraham's nephew Lot looked out over it from the hills of Canaan, he compared it to the Garden of Eden and to Egypt itself. Sodom's great crime was not poverty, it was not ignorance. What made Sodom the most feared city in biblical history was what its wealth and its power had transformed its people into. Stay with this, because the reality of what Sodom actually was is far more disturbing than the legend. To understand Sodom, you have to begin not with the fire, but with the valley. The Jordan Rift Valley is one of the deepest geological formations on the surface of the earth. Running north to south through the heart of the ancient Levant, the rift descends to the lowest point on the planet's surface at the edge of the Dead Sea, which sits more than 400 meters below the level of the Mediterranean. But in the second millennium before the Common Era, the southern end of this valley was not a salt desert. It was a living landscape fed by the Jordan River and the network of springs and seasonal streams that drained the highlands to the east and west into the valley floor. The soil was dark and rich with the alluvial sediment deposited by centuries of annual flooding. The air was heavy with moisture in the growing seasons. The trees were thick along the river margins. This was, by the standards of the ancient Near East, extraordinarily productive land. The Genesis account in chapter 13 preserves a description of this region from the perspective of someone who actually stood there and looked at it. When Abraham and Lot had to separate their households because their combined flocks and herds had grown too large for any single territory to support, Lot lifted his eyes toward the Jordan Valley and saw a plain that Genesis describes as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. That comparison to Egypt was not poetic excess. Egypt was the wealthiest agricultural civilization in the known world, a civilization built on the annual flooding of the Nile and the resulting fertility of the delta and floodplain. To compare the Jordan Valley to Egypt in the context of agricultural potential was to make a serious claim about productive capacity. Lot was looking at land capable of sustaining dense urban populations, generating significant surpluses, and supporting sophisticated commercial civilization. 5 cities occupied this valley. Genesis calls them the cities of the plain: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Scholars call this group the Pentapolis, a confederation of 5 city-states, each governed by its own king, each with its own walls and legal system and distinct identity, but bound together by geography, commercial interdependence, and mutual treaty obligations. The exact locations of these cities have been debated by archaeologists and biblical scholars for over a century. Several candidate sites have been excavated in the Jordan Valley and around the margins of the Dead Sea. Tall El Hammam, a substantial Bronze Age site on the north side of the Dead Sea, has attracted significant research attention in recent decades. Excavations there have revealed dense multi-story urban architecture, enormous grain storage infrastructure, sophisticated pottery assemblages, and evidence of a civilization at the peak of its development before suffering an abrupt and catastrophic end. Bab Edra and Numaira, 2 sites near the southeastern shore of the Dead Sea, also show the characteristic pattern of dense Bronze Age urban settlement followed by sudden complete abandonment. No single archaeological identification has achieved universal consensus, and the scholarly conversation continues. But the broader picture is clear. The Jordan Valley in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era was densely settled, intensely agricultural, and home to genuinely substantial urban centres. The point is not to settle the precise location of Sodom on a modern map. The point is this: Wherever Sodom stood in that valley, it was a real city, built by real labor over generations, accumulated real wealth through real commercial activity, maintained real courts of law, real temples, real markets, and real families going about real daily lives inside its walls. When Genesis talks about Sodom, it is talking about a Bronze Age urban civilization with all the complexity that implies not a fairy tale city of simple wickedness, but a functioning human settlement that had arrived through a long process of accumulated choices at a particular destination. And that destination is the subject of this documentary. Caravan routes connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia ran through the Levantine corridor, of which the Jordan Valley was a critical section. The two greatest civilizational powers of the ancient world maintained constant commercial contact through this corridor. Goods of enormous variety and value moved along these routes in both directions. Copper from the mines of the Sinai Peninsula and Cyprus, cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon, grain from Egypt in both bulk and processed forms, textiles from Mesopotamia, lapis lazuli that had travelled from mines in what is now Afghanistan through a chain of intermediaries stretching thousands of kilometres before reaching the Levantine coast. The volume and regularity of this trade was sufficient to support a sophisticated system of weights and measures, credit instruments, merchant guilds, and professional caravan operators. Any city positioned on these routes could generate substantial revenue without producing all of it themselves. The services that a well-supplied caravan city could offer were valuable and constantly in demand. Secure accommodation for merchants and their animals, food and water at predictable prices, storage facilities where goods could be held safely while the merchant conducted further business in the region, access to local agricultural products for resupply, and protection against the bandits who preyed on isolated stretches of the road. To a city that provided these services consistently and at fair prices built a commercial reputation that attracted increasing traffic. More traffic meant more revenue, more opportunity for local craftsmen to sell their work, more access to imported goods for the city's own population, and greater political weight in the regional system. This is the first thing you have to understand about Sodom. Its wealth was structural, not accidental. It was the product of geography, positioning, and the capacity to participate in the largest commercial networks of the ancient world. That wealth had been accumulating for generations before the events described in Genesis, and it had created a city of genuine sophistication and considerable power. That is precisely what makes what happened in Sodom worth examining carefully. Now, because what the city did with that wealth and that power is the story. The political history of the Pentapolis emerges in detail from Genesis chapter 14, one of the most historically textured passages in the entire book of Genesis. The chapter describes what scholars sometimes call the War of the Kings, a military confrontation involving 9 named rulers across 2 coalitions, set against a specific geographical backdrop in the southern Jordan Valley. The narrative structure is straightforward. For 12 years, the 5 kings of the cities of the plain had paid tribute to a coalition of 4 eastern rulers, led by Chedorlaomer of Elam. In the 13th year, the 5 kings revolted and refused to pay. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer's coalition assembled and marched through the Transjordan on a campaign of punitive subdual, moving city by city southward until they reached the valley of Siddim, described with the specific geographical detail that it was full of bitumen pits, a feature consistent with the Dead Sea region, where the 5 kings made their stand. The battle was a disaster for the Pentapolis. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fell into the bitumen pits while attempting to flee. The surviving forces scattered into the surrounding hills. Chedorlaomer's coalition plundered the cities, taking goods and captives, including Lot, who by this point had moved from living near Sodom to living inside it. The coalition's army then withdrew eastward, carrying the spoils. Abraham received word of his nephew's capture from a survivor who escaped to bring him the news. His response was swift and militarily significant. He armed 318 trained men from his own household. The word used for these men implies professional fighters, not civilian farmers pressed into temporary service, and pursued the coalition forces northward, attacking them at night near Dan, routing them, and pursuing them further north to recover the captives and the plundered goods. After Abraham's return, Sodom's king Bera met him in the valley of Shaveh and offered a transaction. "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." Abraham's refusal was absolute and explicitly principled. He had sworn to God that he would take nothing belonging to the king of Sodom. Not a thread or the thong of a sandal, because he would not allow Bera to be able to say that he had made Abraham rich. This refusal is significant beyond its immediate context. Abraham had just demonstrated that he possessed the military capacity to defeat a coalition that had routed 5 city-states. He was negotiating from a position of complete strength, and yet his concern was not the negotiation itself, but the association. He did not want to be seen as enriching himself through a transaction with Sodom's king. The city's reputation, whatever that reputation consisted of at this point, was already such that Abraham considered commercial association with its king a moral liability rather than an economic opportunity. The king of Sodom was a functioning political authority. He governed a city with documented military history, established tribute relationships with regional powers, and enough economic weight to be worth a major military campaign. When we reconstruct Sodom in our imagination, we should see not a dusty outpost of isolated depravity, but an urban centre confident in its own standing, led by rulers who sat at diplomatic tables with other major players in the regional system and negotiated the terms of power and profit. Entering Sodom through its main gate in the years before its destruction would have been an immersive encounter with a fully operational Bronze Age city. The gate complex itself was the most architecturally significant structure after the temple in any ancient Near Eastern urban centre. It was not simply a gap in a wall with a wooden door. A Bronze Age Canaanite city gate was a multi-chambered defensive structure set into the thickness of the city wall, creating a guarded passage of considerable depth and complexity. The standard gate design involved a series of guard chambers arranged on either side of the central passage, allowing guards stationed there to observe, challenge, and if necessary arrest anyone attempting to enter. The passageway could be sealed at multiple points, heavy wooden doors reinforced with bronze fittings swinging on stone pivots set into the threshold, creating compartmentalized sections that could trap hostile forces in a kill zone while defenders attacked from above. The walls surrounding the city were massive by the standards of their period. Mud brick was the dominant construction material in the Jordan Valley, where the flat alluvial plain offered less access to the stone quarries that builders in the Judean highlands relied on. Bronze Age mud brick walls in this region typically measured 5 to 8 metres thick at the base, with heights that would have reached 10 to 12 metres or more in their operational state. The sheer volume of organised labour required to produce and lay the millions of mud bricks needed for walls of this scale, bricks that had to be mixed, formed, dried, and transported from production areas to the building site, represents a level of urban organisation and coerced or organised communal labour that implies a sophisticated administrative system behind it. Tall El Hammam's excavations have revealed wall systems of extraordinary scale for the period. The site shows evidence of multi-storey mud brick construction across a substantial area, with administrative buildings, storage facilities, and what appear to be both residential and commercial zones identifiable in the excavated sections. The picture that emerges is of a city that had invested seriously in its own permanence and defence. Inside the gate, the city revealed itself. The streets were narrow by any modern standard. 2 to 3 meters wide in the residential quarters, slightly broader in the commercial zones near the gate complex itself. Mud brick walls rose on both sides, their surfaces coated with lime plaster that reflected the intense sunlight back into the narrow passages in sharp white glare. The plaster helped protect the mud brick from the erosive effects of rainfall and provided a surface smooth enough to paint decorative borders around doorways and windows, marks of household status and religious affiliation visible to anyone passing by. The smell of the city was layered and constant. Cooking smoke from the dozens of household fires burning at morning and evening, fueled by dried animal dung and wood. The particular warm earth scent of sun-heated mud brick. The sharp ammonia of livestock in the ground floor rooms of courtyard houses. Goats, sheep, chickens sharing domestic space with their owners in an arrangement that was standard practice across the ancient Near East. Olive oil burning in small clay lamps that provided interior light in the darker rooms. Fermenting grain in the storage jars. Leather being worked in the craftsman's quarter. The accumulated organic complexity of thousands of people and animals living in close proximity on streets that had no drainage or waste collection system. The sound environment was equally dense. The low rhythmic grinding of stone saddle querns, processing grain into flour. A sound that started at sunrise from the courtyard houses throughout the residential quarters and continued for hours, carried out by women kneeling over the grinding stones in a repetitive physical effort that could require 2 to 3 hours of daily labour just to produce enough flour for a family's day. The thud and clatter of hand looms from the weaving rooms. The ring of a metalworker's hammer from the craftsman's district. The braying of donkeys loaded with goods moving through the market streets. The calls of merchants. The sound of livestock on the move toward the market. The voices of people conducting ordinary daily business in the streets. The buildings were mostly 2 stories in the wealthier sections of the city, a single story in the poorer residential quarters. The standard residential form was the courtyard house, a structure organised around a central open court that served as the household's light source, primary workspace, and social hub. Animals were kept in the ground floor rooms that surrounded the courtyard on at least one side. Cooking was done in the courtyard or on the flat roof over simple clay ovens set on stone bases, fueled by any combustible material available. Grain was stored in large ceramic storage jars in designated rooms that maintained relatively stable temperature and humidity. The upper story contained sleeping and private living spaces accessible by a staircase, sometimes an interior stair, more often external stone or mud brick steps attached to the outside of the building. Flat rooftops functioned as essential living space. In the long dry summer months, sleeping on the roof was common practice. The nighttime temperature above the heat-radiating walls of the city was significantly lower than inside the enclosed rooms, and the breeze at elevation made sleep possible when the closed interiors were suffocatingly hot. Grain could be spread on rooftops to dry before threshing. Flax was processed there. The roof was the threshold between the private life of the household interior and the urban world of the city around it, a liminal space that appears repeatedly in biblical narrative as the place where people see what they should not see, pray, conduct private conversations, and make crucial decisions. A city of Sodom's apparent size and regional significance could have supported a population of anywhere from 4,000 to 10,000 inhabitants within its walls, with additional population in the surrounding agricultural villages and satellite settlements that provided the agricultural labour force for the valley's fields and orchards. Population estimates for Bronze Age urban centres depend on the size of the settled area, the density of occupation, and the ratio of urban to rural population in the regional system, all variables that archaeologists work to reconstruct from excavation data rather than derive precisely. But here is the detail that the numbers tend to obscure. Moving through a city of several thousand people in the early second millennium before the Common Era was an experience of constant social encounter. You knew the faces around you. You recognized the household at the courtyard house on the corner by the smell of whatever they were cooking. You knew who had status and who did not by where they sat in public spaces and how others deferred or did not defer to them. You knew which craftsmen were trusted and which were known to use short measures. Ancient urban life was, for most of its inhabitants, a social environment of extraordinary density and familiarity, a place where reputation was the primary currency, where everyone was known, and where the enforcement of social norms happened through the continuous pressure of communal observation. This social density is what makes the scene in Genesis 19 so significant. The entire male population of the city, everyone who was known by everyone else, all the familiar faces from every quarter, gathered at a single point in unanimous collective action. The gate where Lot sat in Genesis 19:1 was more than an architectural feature. It was the city's most important institutional space. In the ancient Near East, the city gate functioned as the administrative, legal, and commercial heart of urban governance. Every major transaction in a Bronze Age Canaanite city was conducted at the gate, under the eyes of the city's recognized authorities. Property transfers were formalized there, witnessed by the gate officials and recorded on clay tablets or papyrus documents. Marriage contracts were sealed at the gate. Debt agreements, commercial partnerships, inheritance settlements, all of these required the gate's formal recognition to be legally binding. The gate was where the city's judicial system operated. Elders and appointed judges heard disputes and rendered decisions in cases brought before them by citizens. The Book of Ruth, set in this same cultural world, shows Boaz conducting his legal transaction at the gate of Bethlehem with the precise attention to procedural detail that the gate's institutional significance required. 10 elders called as witnesses, the symbolic exchange of a sandal to mark the transfer of rights, the public verbal statement of terms. The Book of Job describes the social devastation of his loss of status in terms of no longer being welcomed at the city gate among the elders. Proverbs describes the virtuous woman as one whose husband is respected at the city gate. The prophets repeatedly condemn corrupted justice in terms of what happens at the gate, the place where justice was supposed to be available to everyone who came seeking it. Lot sitting at the gate of Sodom held recognized civic standing. He was not a marginal foreigner clinging to the edge of tolerance in a city that barely acknowledged him. He was a figure of sufficient status to occupy a position in the city's most important public institutional space. He had achieved the kind of integration into Sodom's civic structure that gave him authority and visibility. He was part of the establishment, and when he saw the two strangers arriving as travelers, recognized immediately as people without local connection, without insider protection, without a place to go, his response was the response of a man who knew exactly what his city would do to them if they were left without protection. His urgency was not hospitality instinct, it was knowledge. The agricultural system that made the Pentapolis wealthy was extraordinary even by the standards of the ancient Near East's most productive regions. The Jordan River and its tributaries created conditions for sustained agricultural productivity that the valley's inhabitants had developed over generations into a sophisticated system of cultivation. The annual flooding of the river deposited fresh alluvial sediment across the valley floor, and restoring soil nutrients that would otherwise be depleted by repeated cropping. Springs emerging from the base of the hillsides provided additional water sources that could be channeled into irrigation features, extending cultivation beyond the river's natural reach. The combination of regular flooding, supplemental irrigation, and the rich alluvial soil produced yields that would have been remarkable by any ancient standard. Grain was the foundation of the entire economic and social system. Wheat and barley were the primary crops, cultivated in the flat valley fields that stretched between the city walls and the river's edge. The harvest in late spring was the critical annual event, the period of maximum communal effort, when the survival of the urban population for the coming year was determined by the results of weeks of intensive agricultural labour carried out by the full population of the surrounding villages and supplemented by the city's own inhabitants. A good harvest meant full granaries, available credit, comfortable provisioning for the caravans, and the economic stability that allowed the city's commercial life to function smoothly. A bad harvest meant shortages, rising prices, debt crises, and potential political instability. Excavations at Tall El Hammam have uncovered grain storage facilities of considerable scale, evidence of an agricultural surplus economy capable of provisioning not just the city's resident population, but the significant additional demand represented by the caravan traffic on the trade routes. Grain storage at this scale was not merely domestic provision, it was a commercial asset of the first order. Cities that controlled large grain reserves could provision caravans at premium prices during the long desert stretches of the routes, could extend grain loans to neighbouring farmers during difficult harvest years at interest rates that, over time, effectively transferred land ownership to the creditors and could pay the city's craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators in grain allocations when metal currency was scarce. The olive groves occupied the terraced hillsides that rose above the valley floor on both sides of the rift. Olive cultivation required different conditions than grain. The deep, wet alluvial soil of the valley floor was actually too fertile for optimal olive production, which thrived on the well-drained, mineral-rich soils of the hillside terraces. Olive oil was among the most valuable commodity goods in the ancient world. Its uses were so numerous and essential: cooking, lamp fuel, skincare and hygiene, ritual anointing, leather preservation, pharmaceutical applications, that no household in the ancient Near East could function without regular access to it. A large ceramic jar of quality olive oil represented months of agricultural labour and commanded significant value on any market in the region. Viniculture was practiced throughout the Levant in this period, and the Jordan Valley's climate, with its warm days and cool nights in the growing season, was entirely suitable for grape cultivation. Wine was not a luxury in the ancient world in the modern sense. It was a dietary staple, safer to drink than water from many sources because fermentation eliminated pathogenic organisms, a source of calories in diets that could be calorie poor in lean seasons, and a substance of central importance in both domestic hospitality and formal religious ritual. The production of wine from local vineyards would have been an important feature of the Pentapolis economy. Livestock were central to daily life in ways that urban experience in the modern world makes genuinely difficult to imagine. Sheep and goats were not simply food animals. They were the primary form of mobile wealth, savings accounts that walked and reproduced, generating milk and cheese on a daily basis, wool for textile production, hides for leather goods, and meat for special occasions rather than regular consumption in ordinary households. Cattle were draft animals for agricultural work. Ploughing the grain fields in autumn required teams of oxen, and threshing grain after harvest was accomplished by driving animals over the cut grain spread on a threshing floor. Donkeys were the universal pack animal for both domestic water hauling and commercial transport. Daily water collection was labour that consumed a significant portion of every household's day. Public wells and cisterns were civic infrastructure, maintained by the city's administration and accessible to the general population. But water had to be carried from source to household in ceramic or leather vessels, and this was primarily women's and female slaves' work, multiple trips of several hundred metres each day, carrying vessels that when full weighed 15 to 20 kilograms. A household's daily requirements for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene demanded several such trips. The physical labor embedded in the daily routine of a Bronze Age urban household was relentless and is almost entirely invisible in historical reconstructions that focus on the city's political and commercial life. Grinding grain was similarly labor-intensive. The saddle quern, a concave lower stone over which an upper grinding stone was pushed back and forth by hand, was the standard grain processing technology. Operating it required a woman to kneel over the lower stone and push the upper grinding stone rhythmically forward and back, turning grain into rough flour one small batch at a time. 2 to 3 hours of grinding per day was required to produce enough flour for a family of 5 or 6. The sound of grain grinding was so constant a feature of ancient urban life that its absence, mentioned explicitly in the book of Jeremiah as a sign of total desolation, would have been as striking as sudden silence in a place where noise had always been present. The commercial economy of Sodom was built on its position as a transit hub in the Bronze Age trade network. The caravan operators moving copper northward from the Sinai Peninsula's mines found in the Jordan Valley cities a reliable source of resupply and accommodation in a corridor that could otherwise stretch for days without accessible water or food. Merchants carrying Egyptian agricultural products and manufactured goods eastward used the valley as a waypoint on the long overland journey to Mesopotamia. Traders moving specialty goods, spices, incense, precious metals, luxury textiles, in either direction stopped here because the cities offered what isolated road sections could not: security for both the merchant and their goods. The merchant class at the top of Sodom's commercial hierarchy was sophisticated by ancient standards. These were people who maintained regular commercial relationships with counterparts in multiple distant cities, who possessed working knowledge of at least 2 or 3 languages, who understood the weight and measure standards of different regional systems well enough to conduct honest or dishonest transactions in any of them, and who had enough accumulated capital to extend credit across long distances and wait months for repayment. Craftsmen occupied the economic middle tier of the urban system. Potters produced the vast range of ceramic goods that every household and commercial operation required. Storage jars of standardized sizes, calibrated to recognized volume measures so that their contents could be valued without individual measurement. Cooking vessels in multiple forms suited to different fuel sources and food preparation methods, water containers designed for efficient carrying, for clay lamps of the simple pinched wick type that provided interior lighting throughout the ancient Near East. Bronze smiths required raw materials sourced from distant locations: copper from the Sinai or Cyprus, tin from mountain sources in Iran or Anatolia, arriving through the same caravan networks that carried luxury goods. The ability to produce bronze tools and weapons was a significant economic and military asset for any city that could sustain it. At the base of the social pyramid were labourers and slaves. Debt slavery was a recognized and extensively regulated legal institution across the ancient Near East. When a farmer whose harvest had failed, or a craftsman whose business had collapsed, or a family facing an unpayable fine could not meet their obligations, the mechanism that ancient Near Eastern legal systems provided was the temporary or permanent transfer of the debtor's labour, or the labour of their family members, to the creditor. The Code of Hammurabi, compiled in Babylon around 1754, before the Common Era, devotes significant sections to the regulation of debt slavery, including provisions that limited the duration of debt servitude for freeborn citizens to 3 years and required the release of debt slaves in certain circumstances. These regulations existed because the institution was common enough to require systematic legal framework. War captives became slaves. Unpurchased slaves arrived through the caravan networks from peripheral regions, where raiding and small-scale warfare produced captives that were sold into the trade networks and moved toward the wealthier urban centres where the demand for labour was greatest. Slave labor was present in every sector of the Bronze Age urban economy. In agricultural operations too large for family labor alone, in craft production workshops that employed slave artisans alongside free craftsmen, in domestic service in the households of the wealthy, and in the large institutional operations of temples and royal administrative centres that required organised labour forces year-round. Now here is what Ezekiel's description of Sodom means when you read it inside this economic context. The prophet writes in chapter 16, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me." Arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. In an economy built on agricultural surplus, caravan taxation, debt mechanisms, and the extraction of value from everyone who passed through without insider protection, these words describe not individual character failings, but a structural class condition. The wealthy merchant families of Sodom, sitting at the top of a system that had generated their prosperity through mechanisms they had inherited and extended and normalized over generations, had achieved the characteristic moral condition of people who benefit so completely from an exploitative system that the exploitation has become invisible to them. The system was not their choice. It was the water they swam in. They ate well. The walls were intact. The granaries were full. The trade routes were active. Everything was working for them. The people for whom it was not working were simply part of the landscape. The religious life of Sodom would have looked to a Bronze Age traveller arriving for the first time like the religious life of any major Canaanite city of the period. The Canaanite pantheon was headed by El, the high god, the father of years, the creator deity, the patriarch of the divine council whose name and authority undergirded the entire cosmic order. El's name was not foreign to Abraham's household. The compound divine names that appear in the Genesis patriarchal narratives, El Elyon, El Shaddai, El Olam, El Roi, all use this same Canaanite divine name as their base. The shared divine vocabulary between the Abraham cycle and the broader Canaanite religious world is not coincidental. It reflects the shared cultural and linguistic substrate of the ancient Levant, a world in which Abraham's distinctive theological understanding of God was developing within and partly against a surrounding religious environment that used the same names and categories. But El was not the focus of most daily Canaanite religious practice. That role belonged to Baal, the storm god, the divine figure whose will determined whether the rains came and whether the agricultural year would be one of abundance or scarcity. Baal was immediately and concretely relevant to the concerns of everyone in the ancient Near Eastern agricultural world, the farmer waiting anxiously for the autumn rains to begin, the merchant whose caravan routes were affected by drought and crop failure in the cities along them, the city administrator whose grain tax revenues depended on what the surrounding farms produced. Baal's cycle of death and resurrection, tied to the annual agricultural cycle of planting and harvest, was the central mythological narrative of Canaanite religious life. The temple to Baal in a major Canaanite city was typically the most imposing single structure in the urban centre after the city walls themselves. It stood on an elevated platform, a mud brick or stone podium that raised the temple above the surrounding buildings and gave it visual dominance over the cityscape, and was built with the finest materials available to the city's economy. The cult statue of the deity occupied the innermost chamber, accessible only to the professional priesthood who performed the daily rituals of feeding, clothing, and serving the divine presence in its material form. The temple was not merely a place of worship in the sense that modern religious experience would recognize. It was a civic institution that administered significant economic resources. Temples held portions of the city's agricultural surplus in their storage facilities. Temple personnel collected tithes from the surrounding farmland, and managed the redistribution of those tithes according to a hierarchy of claims. The deity's share kept in perpetuity, the priesthood's share for their sustenance, the remainder available for distribution to approved recipients or for the financing of construction and maintenance of the temple complex itself. The temple was, simultaneously, a religious institution, an economic institution, and a social welfare institution, the place to which the widow, the orphan, and the destitute could appeal for relief in times of crisis. In Sodom, the temple would have performed all these functions. The priests would have carried out the prescribed rituals. The agricultural tithes would have been collected and stored. The festivals tied to the planting and harvest seasons would have been observed. The city's religious calendar would have been maintained with the regularity and precision that institutional religion requires. But here is what the temple in Sodom could not provide, and what made its meticulous religious observance ultimately meaningless in the biblical evaluation of the city. Canaanite religion was fundamentally a system of cosmic maintenance, not ethical formation. Its theological structure was built around the question of how to keep the divine powers that controlled natural processes favourably disposed toward human civilization, how to ensure the rains came, the crops grew, the city's enemies were defeated, and the cosmic order remained stable. The deities of the Canaanite pantheon were not particularly concerned with how the city's merchants treated travellers, whether the courts delivered impartial justice, or whether the poor had enough to eat. They were concerned with the correct performance of prescribed rituals and the regular delivery of appropriate offerings. This theological architecture meant that a city could maintain active temple observance while simultaneously operating a commercial and legal system built on exploitation and organized hostility. The two were not in tension within Canaanite religious thought. The gods wanted their proper worship. What citizens did to each other and to strangers in the market and in the court was a human affair, not a divine concern, except insofar as it affected the stability of the social order that maintained the temple system. And Sodom had achieved exactly this combination: technically correct religious observance alongside systemic moral collapse. The temple incense burned. The sacrificial fires were lit on schedule. The priests performed their rituals. And outside the temple walls, the city's systems of extraction and organized hostility toward outsiders operated without any religious check or prophetic challenge. The missing voice in Sodom is the voice of a prophet. When Jonah arrived in Nineveh, the other great archetype of urban wickedness in the biblical imagination, the entire city responded. From the king who put on sackcloth and sat in ashes, to the common people who fasted and prayed, to the animals who were included in the communal mourning, Nineveh could hear a voice from outside and respond to it, and something in the city's moral capacity had not been entirely extinguished. The institutional structures of repentance still existed. The possibility of collective moral response was still real. There is no prophet in Sodom, no Jonah, no Isaiah, no Amos, no one arriving from outside the system with a message that could cut through the city's self-understanding. There is only Lot, a man who had integrated himself so deeply into the city's civic establishment that when he tried to warn his own sons-in-law, they laughed at him. They were inside Sodom's frame of reference. The disaster he was describing was literally unimaginable to them, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their entire understanding of how the world worked had been formed inside a city that had made violence into policy and normalized it over generations. To understand what Sodom had actually become, you have to understand the law of hospitality in the ancient Near East, the law it had not merely broken but systematically inverted. In a world without hotels or inns as modern travellers understand them, long-distance travel depended entirely on the willingness of settled communities to receive travellers into their protection. Without reliable hospitality, guaranteed food, water, shelter, and protection from harm, long-distance travel was functionally impossible. And without long-distance travel, the entire commercial system on which ancient urban civilization depended collapsed. No caravan routes, no trade, no exchange of goods, information, or ideas. No civilization as the ancient world understood the term. The ancient Near Eastern code of hospitality, which appears with remarkable consistency across Egyptian wisdom literature, Mesopotamian legal codes, Homeric epic, and the early Hebrew narratives, imposed three specific obligations on a host: to provide shelter for the duration of the guest's stay, to provide food and drink, and to protect the guest from harm while under the host's roof. A guest who had been formally received into a household was inviolable. To harm a received guest was not simply a crime against the guest's person, it was a desecration of the sacred compact between host and guest that the divine order underwrote, a crime against the gods themselves, and a fundamental threat to the social infrastructure of civilization. The practical logic was airtight. Cities that were known to welcome travelers, provide reliable commercial terms, and send travelers safely on their way became preferred stops on the trade routes, attracting more traffic, more commerce, more economic opportunity. Cities that were known to be dangerous for travelers were avoided by every merchant and caravan operator who had the choice of another route. The commercial punishment for violating the hospitality code was severe, immediate, and automatic. You disappeared from the trade network. This is the context in which Lot's behavior in Genesis 19 makes sense. When Lot sees the two strangers arriving at the gate, recognized immediately as travelers without local connection, without established social identity in the city, without anyone inside the walls whose protection they could claim, he moves with urgent purpose to intercept them before they reach the open public square. He bows before them in the formal gesture of welcome. He insists they come to his house immediately rather than spending the night in the open square. When they initially demur, he presses them again. His urgency was not excess of personal hospitality. It was precise, specific knowledge of what would happen to unprotected travellers in Sodom after dark. He was a man who had sat at the city gate long enough to know. Lot prepared food and served his guests. He fulfilled every obligation of the hospitality code. The guests had been formally received. They were under his protection. The compact was in force. Then Genesis 19:4 delivers what may be the most specific and devastating sentence in the entire narrative. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, arms surrounded the house. All the people to the last man, both young and old. The text is specific. This is not a gang from a particular neighborhood. This is not a mob associated with a specific faction or grievance. This is not a criminal element that had escaped the city's normal social controls. This is the entire male adult population of the city, from the oldest men who had spent their entire lives inside Sodom's walls, to the youngest men who had just entered adulthood, responding to the presence of strangers with organized collective action. Every quarter of the city. When a single person commits a crime, it speaks to that individual's moral failure. When a small group commits a crime, it speaks to a subculture or a gang or a failure of local authority. When the entire adult male population of a city participates unanimously in organized aggression against travelers, without dissent, without hesitation, without a single voice declining to participate, it speaks to something that has gone structurally wrong at the level of the civilization itself. Lot stepped out to speak with the crowd. His offer, the offer that Genesis records him making, is morally incomprehensible in any ethical framework. But it must be read against the absolute priority that the hospitality code placed on the protection of guests. In Lot's moral universe, distorted as it had become by years of life inside Sodom's culture, Violating the protection of guests was genuinely unthinkable. The guests had been received. They were inviolable. No alternative, however terrible, was worse than the betrayal of that compact. The city's crowd was not moved. Their response to Lot's attempt at mediation was immediate and revealing. This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them. The crowd reasserted the principle that made their action possible. Lot was an outsider, and outsiders have no standing to challenge what insiders do. The city's culture did not simply reject his argument, it reasserted the foundational claim that had made the entire situation inevitable. In Sodom, only insiders have rights, and the category of insider had been defined in a way that excluded everyone who could have challenged what the insiders had become. Lot's sons-in-law, when he warned them in the night to flee, seemed to him to be joking. They had been formed entirely within Sodom's frame of reference. The destruction he was describing was not merely unexpected, it was literally outside the categories of possibility that their world had given them. Their entire understanding of how things worked, of what cities were, of what the consequences of behaviour looked like, had been shaped by a civilization that had made organised violence its normal. The social hierarchy that organised daily life in Sodom operated along lines immediately legible to any traveller familiar with other Bronze Age cities of the Levant. At the top stood the wealthy merchant families who controlled the city's primary commercial assets, the grain storage facilities, the caravanserai accommodations near the gate, the workshops producing export-quality goods, and the lending institutions through which they extended credit to farmers, smaller merchants, and craftsmen. Their power was primarily economic and self-reinforcing. Access to credit, storage facilities, commercial networks, and legal mechanisms at the gate all flowed through relationships with these families. The city's wealth was visible in the scale of their houses, the quality of the goods moving through their courtyard storerooms, and the deference with which the gate's lesser officials treated their complaints and commercial interests. Below the merchant elite were craftsmen and specialized workers whose skills were too valuable to reduce to simple labor. Potters who could produce standardized storage jars calibrated precisely to accepted regional volume measures so that caravan operators could purchase them by count rather than individual measurement, were specialists whose technical knowledge accumulated over years of apprenticeship and represented genuine intellectual capital. Bronze smiths who produced tools and weapons of consistent alloy quality, weavers who achieved the fineness of linen demanded by luxury markets in Egypt and Mesopotamia, leather workers whose products could withstand months of hard use on the trade routes. These specialists occupied a protected middle tier in the urban economy whose skills gave them leverage that unskilled labourers entirely lacked. The mass of the population occupied the lower tiers, subsistence farmers from the surrounding villages who came to the city to sell what small surpluses their plots produced, daily labourers who hired out their physical strength for agricultural work and construction projects, household servants in the employ of wealthier families, and at the base, the enslaved population whose labour was entirely controlled by others. The specific mechanism of economic exploitation that Sodom operated on its lower tiers ran through the combination of monopoly control over essential resources and legal systems that formalized that control in ways impossible to challenge from below. A farmer who had borrowed grain after a bad harvest and could not repay before the next entered a legal process administered by the gate's judiciary, not in the farmer's interest, but in the creditor's. A travelling merchant who stored goods in the city's facilities while conducting business elsewhere found that the terms of the storage agreement, when disputed, were adjudicated by judges whose relationships with the storage facility operators were transparent to everyone in the city and invisible to no one but the merchant with no local standing. This is not speculation about the specific legal mechanics of a city whose administrative records we do not possess. It is the pattern documented repeatedly across ancient Near Eastern societies by the very law codes that attempted to regulate these abuses. The Code of Hammurabi's extensive provisions protecting debt slaves exist because debt slavery was being systematically abused in ways that required legislative limits. The prophetic literature's repeated condemnation of merchants using false weights and dishonest measures exists because dishonest measures were standard commercial practice in ancient Near Eastern urban markets. The ancient wisdom literature's insistence that rulers protect the widow, orphan, and stranger exists precisely because the natural tendency of human legal and commercial systems, when unchecked by prophetic challenge or genuine commitment to justice, is to protect the interest of those who control them at the expense of everyone else. Sodom had followed this tendency to its logical terminus. Without the prophetic correction that the Ninevites received, without the internal tradition of legal reform that other ancient societies periodically applied under pressure from religious and royal authority, the drift had continued uninterrupted until the city's systems of extraction had become so complete and so normalized that no one inside the walls experienced them as requiring justification. The physical daily reality of Sodom's labouring poor was as remote from the commercial prosperity of the merchant quarter as the distance between their housing revealed. A day labourer in Bronze Age Sodom woke before the first light. The work available that day was determined by what the wealthier households and commercial operations needed done, and it was obtained by presenting at a designated location near the gate complex and waiting to be chosen. An agricultural work during planting and harvest seasons provided more reliable demand, but the wage was set by a labour market structured by a large dependent population and few alternative employers, calibrated precisely to sustain the worker well enough to continue working without providing the surplus that could allow independence or asset accumulation. Food for a labouring household was barley bread, baked each morning from flour ground the same morning, and lentil or chickpea stew for protein. The diet was nutritionally adequate in good times, but became precarious when grain prices rose after a bad harvest, when illness prevented wage earning for a week, or when the additional costs imposed by the city's commercial and legal systems consumed the small margins that ordinarily separated subsistence from crisis. Meat was for feast days and rare household celebrations. Wine was for those who could afford it. Water was free in theory, the public wells and cisterns were civic infrastructure, but labour-intensive in practice, requiring multiple trips per day by household members who could otherwise have been earning wages. The housing available to the labouring poor occupied the least desirable quarters of the city. Single-storey mud brick structures where drainage was worst, ventilation most inadequate, and proximity to the market's commercial activity most absent. The walls were thinner, the roofs were less carefully maintained. The courtyard, if present at all, was barely large enough to turn around in. In the worst years, when economic pressure drove families out of even these modest spaces, they became the people who appear in biblical legal texts and wisdom literature as those sleeping in the open, dependent on charity for overnight shelter. This is the population Ezekiel describes when he speaks of the poor and needy that Sodom refused to help. Not abstract moral categories. Real people, the farmer fallen into debt servitude, the widow whose husband's death had eliminated her household's legal standing and economic capacity simultaneously, the labourer whose illness had eliminated his wage income and whose family was surviving on whatever neighbours could spare, the stranger who had arrived intending to conduct commercial business and found himself targeted by the city's extraction mechanisms instead. The city's wealth was visible in its grain silos, its two-storey merchant houses, its active market streets. What was equally real but far less visible was the mechanism by which that wealth was maintained. The continuous transfer of value from those with less power to those with more, operating through legal, commercial, and social systems that presented themselves as neutral administration while functioning in entirely predictable ways in favor of the powerful. One dimension of Sodom's reality deserves particular attention. The city's relationship with Lot himself illuminates the full complexity of what it meant to live inside a civilization whose foundational values were in conflict with your own, but whose material rewards were substantial enough to make that conflict worth tolerating year after year until the moment of total crisis arrived. Lot had chosen Sodom. When Abraham and Lot separated, the choice was his. He had looked at the Jordan Valley, recognized its agricultural and commercial potential, and moved toward it. Not under compulsion, not under deception. He had chosen the same things that motivated the city's own merchant elite: wealth, productivity, commercial opportunity. And over time he had not remained a peripheral observer of the city's culture, but had integrated into it deeply enough to hold a recognized position at the gate. And yet when the crisis came, the city revealed what it had always thought of him. This fellow came here as a foreigner. Despite years of civic service, despite his gate position, despite his visible integration into the city's establishment, the moment his outsider loyalty became visible, the moment he invoked an ethical standard the city had abandoned, the category that the city had always held available was immediately applied. He was a foreigner, an outsider, a person without standing to challenge what insiders did. The city had allowed Lot to participate in its civic life while never actually including him in the community of people whose rights it protected. His integration was conditional and revocable. The condition was that he not challenge the city's core operating principle, that insiders could do anything to outsiders, and outsiders had no recourse. The moment he challenged that principle, the condition was revoked. This dynamic, conditional integration that evaporates the moment the integrated person challenges the system's fundamental assumptions, is among the most persistent features of corrupted social systems in human history. It is not unique to Sodom. What is unique in the biblical account is the completeness with which it had been realized. A city where even the most integrated outsider, even a man who had sat at the gate for years, could not find space within the system to make a moral argument that the system was bound to hear. The nighttime life of the city was structured by the absence of artificial light bright enough to make the streets safe public spaces. Clay lamps burning olive oil provided interior illumination sufficient for close work within a room. But the street network after sunset was genuinely dark, and in a city where the social consensus around the treatment of strangers had created specific geographies of danger, the open public square inside the gate, the space where travellers in other cities waited safely for assistance if they had not yet secured accommodation, had been converted by Sodom's culture into something different. Lot's urgent insistence that the strangers not spend the night in the square was not excessive caution. It was accurate knowledge of what the square in Sodom had become after dark. The distance between what a city's public spaces were supposed to represent and what they had actually become in Sodom's case is the clearest single measure of how completely the city's transformation was. Civic infrastructure, the gate, the square, the wells, with the legal courts, existed in every Bronze Age city as the mechanisms through which the city protected and served all of its inhabitants and their guests. In Sodom, all of these mechanisms had been repurposed. The gate had become the entry point for extraction rather than welcome. The square had become a hunting ground after dark. The legal courts had become instruments of the creditor class. The wells remained accessible, but only because water could not be easily monopolized. Every other resource that could be monopolized had been. A civilization reveals itself most completely, not in its declarations of value or its ritual observances, but in what it does with the mechanisms of power it has built. Sodom had built extensive mechanisms of power: walls, courts, storage facilities, commercial networks, temple institutions. What it had done with all of them was entirely consistent. It had used them to concentrate benefit among those who already had it, and to extract value from everyone else. The geological context in which the cities of the plain stood gives the destruction that followed a specific physical character worth examining carefully. The Dead Sea Rift, the transformed fault boundary where the African tectonic plate meets the Arabian plate, runs directly through the southern end of the Jordan Valley, beneath the very floor where the cities of the plain had been built. This is one of the most seismically active regions on the surface of the Earth. Major earthquakes occur in this region with regularity. One destroyed much of the city of Jericho in historical times, and ancient accounts reference multiple large seismic events affecting the southern Levant. The Jordan Valley's characteristic flat floor, its geological instability, and the peculiar chemistry of the Dead Sea that has always made its shores and surroundings smell of sulfur are all features of the same underlying geological reality. Beneath the valley floor, and particularly around the Dead Sea region, lie significant deposits of bitumen, natural gas, and sulfur. These are not hypothetical features. The bitumen pits of the Valley of Siddim mentioned in Genesis 14 were real enough to serve as strategic military terrain in the battle between the kings. Sulfur deposits are physically present along the shores of the Dead Sea in quantities large enough to have supplied the incense trade of the ancient world. Or natural gas seepage from underground deposits into the surface environment was likely a known feature of the landscape. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Scientific Reports presenting their analysis of the destruction layer at Tal el Hammam. The physical evidence they examined was extraordinary. Building materials in the destruction layer showed signs of exposure to temperatures far exceeding anything a normal structural fire, burning wood, grain, oil, could produce. Pottery surfaces showed characteristics consistent with rapid heating to temperatures above 1100 degrees Celsius, temperatures that can vitrify clay, transforming it partially into glass-like material. The destruction layer contained what geologists call shocked quartz, a form of the mineral that can only be produced by the extreme pressures generated by hypervelocity impacts or very large explosive events. Platinum group metals associated with cosmic impactors were present in the destruction layer at anomalous concentrations. The researchers' conclusion: the most consistent explanation for the complete pattern of evidence was a cosmic airburst, a large meteor or bolide entering the atmosphere and exploding above the surface before reaching the ground. Such an event would generate a supersonic pressure wave and an intense pulse of radiant heat travelling outward from the explosion point, capable of flattening and igniting everything in its path across a radius of many kilometres, and producing the extreme temperatures recorded in the destruction layer without leaving an impact crater. The researchers estimated the event at roughly the equivalent energy of a very large nuclear weapon. The proposed date of the event, based on the archaeological stratigraphy, falls around 1650 before the Common Era. The region around the Dead Sea was subsequently abandoned for centuries. The dense network of agricultural villages and urban centres that had populated the southern Jordan Valley was simply gone. The area that Genesis describes as resembling the Garden of Eden became, in the archaeological record, one of the most significant discontinuities in the Bronze Age settlement pattern of the entire Levant. Whatever the precise mechanism of the end of the cities of the plain, and the scientific conversation continues to develop as additional data emerges, the archaeology confirms what the narrative describes: an abrupt, catastrophic, and total destruction of a civilization at the peak of its development, followed by the complete abandonment of the affected region for an extended period. The valley Lot had chosen for its resemblance to paradise became a landscape that people avoided for generations. The rhythm of a year in Sodom followed the agricultural calendar with the regularity of all ancient Near Eastern urban civilization, but the experience of that calendar was radically different depending on where in the city's social hierarchy you occupied your life. For the merchant elite, the harvest season was an opportunity. Grain poured into the city's storage facilities from the surrounding agricultural villages, carried on donkey back in large sacks that each animal could transport from field to granary over the course of a single day's repeated journey. The merchants who controlled storage capacity received the grain as payment for debts, as tithes administered through the temple's commercial arm, and as straightforward commercial purchases at the harvest time prices that were always the year's lowest. They would hold it. Through the winter months, as distance from the harvest increased and uncertainty about the next year's crop began to weigh on households that had consumed their own reserves, the price of grain would rise. The merchants who controlled storage would sell into the rising market. This was not secret, when it was not illegal by the standards of ancient commerce. It was simply how the system worked, and it worked in their favour with the reliability of seasons. For the labouring poor, the harvest season was an opportunity of a different kind, one that had to be seized with maximum physical effort while it lasted, because the opportunity was temporary and the consequences of failing to take full advantage were serious. Day labouring rates during harvest could be higher than at other times of year, because the demand for labour was intense, and the window for completing the harvest before the grain spoiled or the rains came was fixed by nature rather than by commercial preference. Every able-bodied member of a labouring household went to the fields during harvest. Children who would not appear in the city's market or administrative records went to the fields. Old people who normally stayed close to home went to the fields. The harvest was the one moment in the agricultural year when labour had leverage, when the need for hands exceeded the available supply of labour at the going rate, when a family could accumulate the small surplus that might carry them through the following winter. The gleaning laws that appear in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the requirements that corners of grain fields be left unharvested and fallen grain not be gathered, so that the poor and the stranger could come after the harvesters and collect enough food for their own use, reflect an ancient Near Eastern tradition of agricultural social welfare whose very existence in legal form demonstrates that the natural behaviour of landowners, without legal compulsion, was to harvest everything and leave nothing. In cities and agricultural systems operating according to their own commercial logic, the corners got harvested and the fallen grain got picked up. The legal requirement to leave them was a prophetic and legislative correction to the system's natural tendency. Whether Sodom's legal system included equivalent protections for its poor at any point in its history, and if so, how long those protections remained in force before being eroded, the biblical text does not tell us. What the text tells us is that by the time Ezekiel identifies Sodom's core failure, the failure to provide for the poor and needy was not a recent development or a crisis response. It was a settled feature of the city's operating condition, described alongside arrogance and excess as the characteristic moral posture of the place. The festivals of the religious calendar offered the one regular interruption of this system, the one occasion when the hierarchies of daily commercial and civic life were notionally suspended in the service of collective religious experience. In Canaanite religious practice, major festivals involved communal sacrificial meals at which the meat of the sacrificed animals was distributed to participants. In properly functioning temple economies, this distribution was meant to reach the entire population, including the poor who had no ordinary access to meat as a regular dietary element. Temple festivals were, in theory, the great equalizer, the moment when the city acknowledged its common humanity before the gods by sharing food across social divisions that were otherwise total. In practice, how well this redistribution function worked depended entirely on the values of the temple administration and the political will of the city's leadership. In cities where the temple leadership genuinely believed in the redistributive obligation they administered, Festivals were genuine occasions of social solidarity and economic leveling. In cities where the temple had become an administrative extension of the merchant class, which was a common trajectory for temple institutions in ancient Near Eastern urban settings, because the merchant class had the wealth to endow temples and the political connections to influence the selection of temple personnel, the redistributive function became formalized in ways that looked correct from outside but delivered less and less to those at the bottom. By the time Lot sat at Sodom's gate, the city's religious institutions had followed this trajectory far enough that they provided no significant check on the commercial and legal exploitation that Ezekiel later identifies as the city's characteristic failure. The festivals happened. The sacrifices were offered. The rituals were performed correctly. And the poor remained poor, and the stranger remained without protection, and the city's systems continued operating in the only direction they had been running for a very long time. The final and perhaps most theologically significant feature of Sodom's condition was the silence that surrounded it. Not silence in the literal sense. The city was loud with commercial activity, with the sound of its craftsmen, with the voices of its market streets. But a moral silence, a silence where the voice of prophetic challenge should have been. In the biblical account of Israel's own prophetic tradition, the moment when a society's drift toward exploitative practices becomes severe enough to attract divine attention is precisely the moment when the prophetic voice becomes most urgent and most public. Amos stands in the prosperous market of Bethel and shouts. Isaiah walks through the streets of Jerusalem in sackcloth. Jeremiah dictates scrolls and has them read publicly in the temple courts. The prophetic voice in the Hebrew tradition is specifically, persistently, loudly opposed to the social conditions that characterize Sodom's failing. Exploitation of the poor, denial of justice to the vulnerable, excess among the wealthy, alongside indifference to the needy. Sodom had no such voice, not because God was indifferent to its condition. The accumulating outcry that Genesis 18 describes suggests divine awareness of what was happening, but because the city had built itself into a social environment in which such a voice could not arise from within it and could not be heard from without it. A prophet arriving in Nineveh could speak to a city that had enough remaining moral capacity to hear and respond. A prophet arriving in Sodom would have found Lot's sons-in-law, people whose frame of reference was so completely determined by the city's values that the very idea of catastrophic divine response to how the city operated was simply funny to them. The silence was not absence of awareness, it was completion of capture. When a civilization has advanced far enough into its own internal logic, when the systems of exploitation and exclusion have become so normalized that they are simply the background condition of ordinary life, when the people who might have challenged the system have been integrated into it on terms that make challenge impossible without losing everything they have built. When the young have been formed entirely within the system's frame of reference and cannot imagine alternatives, the silence that results is not peaceful. It is the silence of a conclusion already reached, a process already completed, a direction already fixed so thoroughly that no internal correction is available. Abraham's negotiation with God in Genesis 18 takes on its full weight in this context. He was not negotiating for an abstraction. He was asking whether the presence of even a small group of people living differently, 10, just 10, could represent enough of an alternative within the city's walls to constitute the seed of something that might eventually grow into genuine correction. 10 people whose lives demonstrated that another possibility existed. In 10 people whose presence prevented the moral collapse from achieving the total social consensus that would make it irreversible. There were not 10. And that, more than the fire, more than the destruction, more than the geological catastrophe that ended the cities of the plain, is the most devastating fact in the entire narrative. The most important moment in the entire Sodom narrative is not the destruction. It is the conversation between Abraham and God on the road overlooking Sodom, before the angels have even reached the city gate. Genesis 18:16-33 records a dialogue with no real parallel in the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition. God declares that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so serious that an investigation is required. Abraham, who apparently understands what the outcome of such an investigation will be, does something remarkable. He argues, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" He is not simply petitioning for mercy, he is appealing to a principle. He is arguing that the judge of the universe is bound by justice, the same justice that Sodom's own legal system had abandoned. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? God agrees. For 50 righteous, the city will be spared. Abraham presses forward, acknowledging the audacity of his argument with characteristic self-awareness. Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if there are 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? At each threshold, God agrees. For each minimum number of people living in basic righteousness within the city's walls, the city would be preserved. The negotiation ends at 10. Abraham stops. He does not ask about fewer than 10. The text does not explain why. The silence is significant. The ancient rabbis observed that 10 is the minimum number required for a communal Jewish prayer gathering, the minyan. 10 people is not just a small number, it is the minimum viable moral community, the smallest number around which shared values can be actively practiced, transmitted, and maintained. Fewer than 10, and you no longer have a community with a moral alternative to offer. You have isolated individuals who can do no more than suffer within a system they cannot change. Abraham's negotiation establishes a principle. God does not desire the destruction of even a corrupt city if there is a viable moral community within it, capable of offering an alternative and sustaining itself against the surrounding pressure. 10 people living differently is enough. 10 people whose lives demonstrate that another way is possible, whose presence prevents the moral collapse from achieving total completion. 10 would be enough. There were not 10 in Sodom. In a city of thousands, a city with enough population to send its entire adult male population into the streets simultaneously, a city wealthy enough to be a regional power, is sophisticated enough to maintain complex legal and commercial institutions, there were not 10 people whose lives were oriented toward justice, hospitality, and care for the vulnerable. The social environment had become so completely hostile to basic human decency that it could not sustain even the minimum viable moral community. Lot himself, described by the New Testament as a righteous man, had been shaped by Sodom in ways that made his righteousness compromised and partial. He had chosen the city. He had integrated into its civic structure. His response to the mob, driven by genuine commitment to the hospitality code, was morally catastrophic in what it offered as an alternative. His sons-in-law could not hear his warning. His wife looked back. Even the most righteous person in Sodom had been formed by Sodom. The story of Sodom did not end with its destruction. In the biblical imagination, it became the paradigm case, the permanent reference point for what happens to a civilization that completes its moral collapse. Isaiah, prophesying to 8th century Jerusalem during a period of military threat and social disruption, invokes Sodom with the calculated shock of a man choosing the most extreme available comparison. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Jerusalem, the city of David, the site of Solomon's temple, the place that Psalm 48 calls the perfection of beauty, the joy of the whole earth, compared to Sodom by its own prophet. Isaiah was not making a rhetorical overstatement. He was saying, with the precision that prophetic language required, that Jerusalem had reproduced Sodom's specific conditions: rulers who exploited the poor, courts that denied justice to the widow and the orphan, commercial systems that extracted wealth from the vulnerable while celebrating the prosperity of the insiders. Jeremiah invokes Sodom during the siege of Jerusalem. The punishment of my people is greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment without a hand turned to help her. The comparison is to the totality and speed of the judgment, and the implicit claim is that Jerusalem had earned it through similar failures. Ezekiel's analysis in chapter 16 is the most careful theological engagement with Sodom in the entire prophetic tradition. He is not using Sodom as a rhetorical insult. He is using it as a diagnostic category. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. The sequence is the theology. The detestable things, whatever specific practices are implied, come at the end as the terminal expression of a moral trajectory that began with arrogance, material excess, and systematic indifference to the poor. Sodom did not start with its worst behaviors. It arrived at them through a long process of accumulated moral compromise that began with the simpler failures Ezekiel names first. Amos, the shepherd from Tekoa, who stood in the prosperous markets of 8th century Israel and condemned its commercial exploitation of the vulnerable, and invokes the destruction of the cities of the plain as the standard against which God measures fidelity. I overthrew some of you as I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. You were like a burning stick snatched from the fire, yet you have not returned to me. The warning embedded in this comparison is that the same social conditions, selling the righteous for silver, trampling the poor, denying justice to the needy at the gate, attract the same kind of response. Jesus, in his instructions to the disciples about how to proceed when their message is rejected by a town that refuses to receive them, invokes Sodom in explicitly hospitality terms. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. The comparison he draws is specifically about reception, about the willingness of a community to hear voices from outside itself, to welcome messengers bearing something the community does not already possess. Not primarily about a single category of sexual behavior, about the failure to receive the stranger who arrives with something that could change everything. The thread running through every biblical invocation of Sodom across 1,000 years of prophetic and wisdom literature is not a single specific sin. It is a comprehensive moral collapse. The rejection of the stranger, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the corruption of justice expressed in a community so unified around these failures that correction from within had become impossible, and voices from outside were met with organized violence. Standing at the edge of the Dead Sea today, looking out over the mineral blue water that covers what was once the fertile valley floor of the ancient Jordan plain, it is possible to understand what was actually lost when the cities of the plain ended. Not just the buildings, which were mud brick and would have eroded anyway. Not just the lives of the people who went about their ordinary days in those courtyard houses and market streets. Something more specific was lost, and something more specific was demonstrated. A civilization that had figured out how to extract maximum agricultural productivity from one of the most fertile valleys in the ancient Near East, that had positioned itself on the most lucrative trade routes of its era, built substantial defensive architecture, maintained complex legal and commercial institutions, organized its religious and civic life with all the sophistication of a major Bronze Age urban center, had simultaneously constructed a social order that was systematically destroying the humanity of everyone who passed through it, and had found no internal mechanism for recognizing or correcting what it had become. The prosperity was real. The granaries were full, the market streets were active, the walls were intact, the temple fires burned on schedule. By every external measure that ancient cities used to evaluate their own success, Sodom was succeeding. What Sodom could not see, or had chosen, generation after generation, to stop looking at, was that the prosperity was eating itself. A commercial civilization that destroys the law of hospitality destroys the trust that long-distance commerce depends on. A legal system that becomes an instrument of extraction destroys the social contract that makes urban life sustainable. A city that organizes its entire male population into unanimous hostility towards strangers has eliminated the one external perspective capable of showing it what it has become. Abraham asked, "What if there are 10? There were not 10. There were not 10 people in a city of thousands living in a way that demonstrated that another possibility was still imaginable from inside those walls." The question the story of Sodom leaves open. Across every century, it has been carried in the biblical tradition, across every culture that has tried to understand what it means, is not primarily a question about geology or archaeology or the precise nature of the destruction event in the Dead Sea Valley. It is a question about what civilizations build, and whether what they build serves all the people inside it and those who arrive at its gates from outside. It is a question about whether prosperity and moral health can coexist over time, or whether prosperity, in the absence of sustained moral attention to the most vulnerable, always arrives eventually at Sodom's gate. If you could walk back into the Jordan Valley before the fire, through Sodom's gate, past Lot sitting in his position of civic authority, through the market streets and past the grain silos and into the courtyard houses where families were going about their ordinary days, you would be walking through a city that looked like success from the inside. The walls were solid. The food was abundant. The trade routes were open. And the answer the city was giving every single day was visible only if you were arriving at that gate with no one inside those walls to protect you. If you were that stranger, Sodom's answer was not ambiguous. The question is which perspective we use to determine whether what we have built is working.